Hello, everyone. So I looked at this article and I'm basing this article on a news segment that I saw a couple of days ago, I'd say maybe a week ago, or within maybe half a week ago. So, uncovering the history of African American composers. So, this is Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. And so, unbeknownst to which I already felt that there's always hiding. Whenever there's always hiding of, artists, writers, actors, people who are in the entertainment world that were from way back when, black people, um, you best believe there were classical artists and classical composers and music artists that were hidden away. They as in the white mainstream uh, music industry usually tends to be at the forefront, and you usually go to school, you hear about Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, and all of the white composers, but you almost never hear anything about black music composers and lyricists and people who, unless it has to do with rhythm and blues or soul or hip hop, they somehow made black people feel as though that we were not anywhere involved in classical music, which is a huge distortion of our history. So this article, it says Uncovering the History of African American Composers by Frank Mercurio. Okay, and so it basically gives a synopsis, or it gives feedback on some of the things that people assume to be so, which we will find out is something altogether different. So the phrase American music conjures images of jazz, blues, country, western, gospel, rock and roll, hip hop, even Broadway musical traditions born and cultivated here in the U.S. and now known and enjoyed by listeners all around the world. But what about classical music in America? So, distinctively American brand contemporary classical often gets lost in the mix of speaking of American musical traditions. So, when it is recognized, the genre is often represented by older white males, Aaron Copland, Philip Glass, John Adams, and like I said, usually in music classes and courses, you learn about Western the history of Western culture, and they get into classical music. They almost always have to mention both Mozart and Beethoven and those greats, what have you. But yet, stereotype doesn't fit the range of the American classical composers, which includes African Americans, both male and female as well. So across gender lines, so there is a body of work that uniquely reflects American life, but though or through the classical lens. And so here you have it. Historically, the work of many of these African American composers has been undervalued and even lost, hidden. These are also hidden figures as well, people. So hidden from history until rediscovered by scholars and musicians in recent years, which really, these were not talked about, are not uplifted. When you don't know who you are, when you assume that you are not worthy, when you attribute yourself to some lower class of being, when you assume that you had nothing to offer in history, then that is how you will live your life accordingly. And so by uncovering this, which was always there, it's just people have to get of age, become functionally literate enough and use common sense to say, there's more to life than what I've been hearing just in school, in the classrooms, which really don't tell black children about who their history really is and who they were before. They always tend to devalue us and make us feel as though we were only slaves and that we had nothing to offer and that we didn't have any culture, and our culture was made as who we are today as American Black folks, when there's a whole nother story altogether that we have not uncovered, that people claim they're just now uncovering. It was always there. It just was not given. We weren't given access to it, or didn't know where to look, or we didn't feel that it existed. We didn't feel it was true because we weren't told the truth, or the truth was withheld from us. So one such find, it turns out to be a landmark moment in history, as they claim a young couple bought an old house in St. Anne's, Illinois, and as they began to renovate it, they came across a number of handwritten musical scores tucked away inside the dilapidated structure. Many displayed the signature of Florence Price. But who was Florence Price? Who was she? So after some research, a couple learned that the house once belonged to a pioneering African-American classical composer. The scores represented some of her unknown and lost works, music that at last would be brought to light. So the Price died in 1953 at age 65, right before the Civil Rights Movement began gaining momentum, and Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954. So life as an African American classical composer was difficult during this era. So not to mention life as a female classical American composer. Yet Price overcame both obstacles and received a fair amount of recognition during her lifetime. But it was a hard-won battle, as evidenced by the number of works that languished inside Prince's summer home in the years after her death. So only within the past few decades have her compositions re-entered the classical repertoire, including her piano concerto in one movement, 1933, which did achieve moderate success in its day, with performances in Chicago and Pittsburgh before the original orchestral score was lost. So Swiss pianist Louis Switzel-Bell, or Switzjabel, and I may not be pronouncing that correct, so excuse me if I'm wrong, performs this piece in its orchestrated form with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, which is abbreviated as CSO, in the American Live Concerts, November 15th to the 16th. So guest conductor Thomas Wilkins leads the orchestra in this program, celebrating a varied works of African American, Black African American composers from different time periods, among them William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, 1930, Duke Ellington's Harlem, 1951, are most closely associated with Harlem's Renaissance. And so contemporary African American composers are also represented. Adolphus Hale Storks and American Port of Call, 1985, conjures the images of the composer's hometown in Norfolk, Virginia, and captures the Hale Storks describes as the strident and occasionally tender and even mysterious energy of a busy American port city. So James Lee Ailes, Sukkot through Orion Nebula, 2011, recalls the parallels between the biblical Hebrews' exile in the wilderness of the 19th century African American journeys from slavery to freedom. An autumn festival of Sukkot, referenced by Lee, not only commemorates past events but also promises a better future from this viewpoint. American Life is an exciting exploration of the threads linking great African American composers' book musical gems back to life while celebrating current achievements and looking forward to the future accomplishments. And so the reason why I mentioned this article, and there are probably other articles that coincide with it, is the fact that I saw a news segment where there was a woman that wrote a book, and I'm going to pull up the title right now, and it is called and if I'm not mistaken, you have these composers. And so these are 8 black composers who changed the course of classical music history. You have Joseph Boulon Chevalier, Florence Price, the one we just talked about, Scott Joplin, George Bridgetower, William Grant Stills, which we also talked about in this article, Samuel Coleridge, and George Walker. And that's just to name a few. And so there are years that are put up here. And so there's a book that I believe is probably on Amazon. So 8 black composers who changed the course of classical music. And so I believe on Amazon there's a book of, if I go to Amazon, I believe I can find it. Let's see here. Okay. Black classical musicians and composers. There are several books, of course, but there was a new book that I know that a woman was mentioning that was on this news segment, and it was, I believe it might have went more like this. So it might come up when I do this. Everything is so it actually doesn't show what I'm looking for, so I probably got the title wrong. Black classical musicians, and so of the 20th century. And so I believe that there's another book, and I've yet to, it didn't look like this cover was the same as this one. But the reason why I brought this up, to get back to why I did this, is because we were looking at a news segment, and there was a woman. She was in a room at a school in New York working with a group of African American children on violin in an orchestra setting. And so she has a book that she had mentioned that there were a lot of African American composers of classical music that were hidden throughout history. And so oftentimes, I remember taking a music class when I was in middle school, and I was never taught about these particular composers, like Florence Price, Scott Joplin, George Bridgetower, William Grant Stills, Samuel Coleridge, George Walker. It always was Bach. It always was all the white composers. of classical music. It was Mozart, um, and every white composer you could think of, and it always had to do with a white view of composers, never any black um, uh, notables like these people here. And so to learn of this article, especially a woman during that time involved in classical music, I thought was a big win-win. But anyway, with this, I'm going to let this video go, but I'm going to leave it at this woman here, Florence Price. I'm going to pull her out. Um, and so there are other people who now she has paved the way for. And this is a picture of Florence Price, who was very much a composer in classical music. And it says one of the few Florence Price, America's first black woman, who she had all to do with classical scene from way back when. And so I'm going to pull this picture up of her. I figured I would do that, because that was hard back then to not only be a black classical artist, but then you're a female. And so here she is, one of the few. Florence Price, America's first black woman composer in 1888, was not an auspicious year for the black girl to be born in the U.S., and so the federal government had ignominiously turned tail on the Reconstruction just 12 years before abandoning the black population of the South to whatever indignities that section of the country cared to inflict on people who had known barely a decade of shambling semi-freedom. So a girl born in the year had little to look forward to, but black codes, resurgence of KKK, Jim Crow, segregation, and the death of anybody attempting to clear a path out of the dehumanizing social architectures of the Deep South. And so, and yet it was in this year that the equally promising city of Little Rock, that a girl named Florence Smith was born to a dentist, painter, inventor, father, and a sopranos, pianist mother, who was destined to marry classical music with a dance, rhythm, spiritual melodies of her people's long-suffering culture to create something new that defined the ground rules of theatrical or theoretical assumption for all who followed. Perhaps Florence Smith, who would become Florence Price upon marrying Thomas Price, straddled two musical worlds so well because of her upbringing of stark contrast. Shortly after her birth, her family moved to Chicago, where she attended elementary school while learning piano from her mother. And we don't know much of these years, but her performance must have been exemplary, for she was attending high school in Little Rock at an age when most of are gearing up for middle school, and graduated from the high school by age 14. So she's extremely gifted. And so from north to south then, and back to north, her astounding progress as both a student and performer of music landed her a spot on the Boston New England Conservatory of Music, so where she double majored in piano and organ while embarking on the first of what would be the 300 compositions. And so her first two works were a string of trio and a symphony. So that second choice is particular significance. So while previous women composers concentrated on vocal music, small chamber forms with occasional concerto thrown in when the composer happened also to be a gifted soloist, and symphony remained a form almost entirely dominated by male composers. For a woman to choose that form in the early 20th century was to make a bold statement, but for women to be not yet 20 years old of age and an act of supreme confidence in herself and the power of her craft. So graduating with honors at the age of 19, she returned to the South. A string of unsettling teaching positions she had held, and first at Cotton Plant, um, and Arkadelphia Academy 1906 to '07, then a stint at Shorter College with 3 years, and finally 2 years at Clark College, where she had or was head of the music department. After her marriage in 1912, she divided her time between music teaching and raising her first son. Tommy was his name, whose early death prompted her to set Julia Johnson Davis' poem "To My Little Son" to music as a way of work through her grief. Besides such personal tragedies, Price also had to weather the institutional racism of Arkansas society. So in spite of her record as a composer and educator, she was denied membership in the Arkansas Music Teachers Association solely on account of her race. And so in 1927, after the black man was accused of assaulting a white woman, was lynched and hung on a street corner in one of Little Rock's more prosperous black neighborhoods, Price made a decision to relocate to Chicago and here where wider opportunities to study, perform, and crucially to publish. Her first opus came in 1928 with a collection of 4 piano pieces. She took further lessons in composition from the likes of Carl Busch and author Olaf Anderson, while earning extra money playing organ for silent film showings. And so those first years were lean ones financially, and for at least some time she was compelled to live with her sons at the home in Estelia Bonds, and linchpin of Chicago culture, who introduced Price to a poet. Langston Hughes was his name, as we all know now, whose work she would famously set to music a short decade later. And so as the U.S. slid into the ghastly throb of the Great Depression in the 1930s, Price paradoxically began scoring the string of public triumphs that would make her one of her time's musical touchstones. In 1932, she won the Wanamaker Award for her first symphony in E minor, which brought with it not only a handsome and much needed $500 check, but a performance by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra under the banner of Frederick Stock at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. So Price was thereby the first black woman to ever have a symphonic piece performed by a major orchestra. The broadcast of that piece brought her to the attention of other orchestras, and ensuing years saw before performances of her piano concerti, as well as memorable performances by Marian Anderson in her arrangement of the spiritual "My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord." The 1940, in that time, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt heard a rehearsal of her work and declared Florence Price one of the few women to write symphonic music, as certainly made a beautiful contribution. And so following that year saw a publication of arguably her most famous piece, a setting of the Langston Hughes poem Songs to the Dark Virgin, hailed by the Chicago Daily News as one of the greatest immediate successes ever won by an American song. Listening to a piece of work, Price's work, or at least the small subset of it which has been published and recorded, it's easy to understand the enthusiasm her age felt for her compositions. Already in the First Symphony, there is a particularly mix of spiritual melody and joie. Dance forms seamlessly melded into orchestral forms that recall the synthic gestures of Antonin Dvorak. And so we have, though, decades of evocative Ken Burns documentary soundtracks grown used to much of the soundscape, but to the 1930s Price music offered a vibrant path forward for classical music that many believe was are bogging itself down in mathematical abstractions that fired the mind but deadened the heart. Tone poems like The Oak harnessed harmony to tell musical stories, while songs for which she earned so much renown reached into deep historic pains and hopes for the words that and clothed them in shifting rhythms and arresting modulations. So, in spite of her growing fame and several high-profile performances like Marian Anderson, Blanche Beebam, and Leontyne Price, most of her work remained unpublished during her life, and so nevertheless, she continued writing and teaching. Even the political atmosphere of 1940s devolved to the bitter disappointments of the early 1950s, and her own health began to filter, slipping into a long illness. She died in 1953. Her work to be carried on by the new generation raised on her example, including Margaret Bonds, Julia Perry, and Evelyn Pittman. Her work had opened the door, and they would, with their very different gifts, ensure it stayed that way. So, in spite of her historically important position, Price is a difficult figure to track down in the historical records. And so that's because of what had happened throughout history with the hiding of the works of people of color. And so the Norton Grove Dictionary of Women Composers gives her a few columns, but for anything more you'll have to look not in the standalone biography of Price, there isn't one, but rather in collections devoted to profiling the history of Black women in classical music, the reigning chronicler of which, Mildred Denby Green, whose Black Women Composers and Geniuses 1983 remains a crucial source. Helen Walker Hill's Form Spiritual of Symphonies 2007, meanwhile, is an easier to come across volume that has the benefit of still being in print. And so it's pretty much that is the article. And so Florence Price music is seldom performed by first-tier recording, further listening artists. The modern age soul-finding recordings that do full justice to the material is difficult. So we're going back to go back to the archives and performers whose lives overlapped with hers and her own. The audio might not be as crisp, but these were some of the greats of their day. And here, for example, is a legendary Leontyne Prince performing My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord. And so this is one of the videos here, and so I'm not going to play it, but that's pretty much the article. And so moving to the modern era, the great baritone Thomas Hampson recorded 2 of her songs on a disc, celebrated the music of Chicago, including her famous songs of Dark Virgin. And then you have a symphony tone poem of The Oak was recently beautifully performed here in Oakland, and see they're on YouTube. So if you want to look at Florence Price, The Oak Symphonic Poem, as part of the commitment of performing music by women composers, that one of the is not available, however. So here another by the Women's Philharmonic Orchestra had done the piece. And so that's pretty much it. So there are videos where you can look up or listen to the music and how it would have been performed. And so I thought this was interesting. I thought it was an interesting article having to do with Black music composers, and what better way to bring up a Black music composer, especially back in the deep South, that had went through a lot of atrocities based on skin color, and what had happened to her is Florence Price, and then also uncovering the histories of the African American composers and the eight people that were notables of African American composers, and so I thought that was pretty interesting. And so it says of the classical, and so these were to name a few of those composers. I did, however, hear about Scott Joplin, but that wasn't until later in life that he was ever mentioned. I know in the earlier years of when I was going to high school, middle school, before high school, the only composers I heard about, they weren't any of these composers. They were all of them, almost all of them. It was always about Bach. It was always about um, Mozart. It was always about, the white composers. It was never about any of these composers like Margaret Braun, Robert Nathaniel Dent, Samuel Coleridge, Scott Joplin, until that was far later, and he was the only one mentioned. Never even women composers that were black back in this time. It was unheard of, and so the eight composers who changed the course of classical music. So there are some books. I think there was a news segment half a week ago that I heard, and I actually had my son to listen to it and look at the segment, because he himself was playing cello, and so you don't find very many of the young people that are interested in classical music as they are the hip hop music, or the main music, are stereotypically what they would feel is in some people's eyes, we think is the black music arena. But however, it is not narrow as people would assume it to be. Is very broad, and including the George Walkers and the William Grant Stills and the Florence Price and Samuel Coleridge and so on, Hale Smith, William Dawson. And so these are just but to name a few of the composers that were back in the days, even like before and during this Jim Crow era, before that, before the Black Power movements, who were very talented. As you heard the story of Florence Walker, how she could come up from the Deep South. And so that, to go through all of that, you'd have to say that it's pretty powerful to learn that about your history, and to learn just how strong we are as people. So having said that, I'm going with this video though. So what do you think about that? I thought that was pretty interesting. It was pretty inspiring, especially on a day like today, Martin Luther King Day, to think of people that were here before us, that went through some really hardcore tribulations and some trials in their life, but overcame those even in the darkest of times. But having said that, I'm going to let this. She seemed like a very beautiful woman, and so as you see pictured here, even in the old photo, and she has in those eyes a lot of strength, like she's seen a lot. But anyway, I'm going to leave this video. So what are your thoughts on that? Uncovering the history of African American and writers and composers. Thanks for listening.